Take it, Max.
All right. Well, thank you very much to the organizers for bringing me here. Thanks also to the ASL interpreters who are doing an amazing job expanding our conversation to other groups of people. And I always like to begin talks by acknowledging a thanks to our hosts, the Mi'kmaq, whose land this is. It's never been ceded. And in fact, we, those of us who are settlers, not Mi'kmaq, owe a great debt of gratitude to the Mi'kmaq people for allowing us to survive and share this land. So I always like to begin that, especially when I'm going to give a talk on debt and creativity. And of course, because it's a TED Talk, I'll begin with a quotation from Albert Einstein, which seems very traditional for this sort of account or this sort of discussion, when he writes that 100 times every day I remind myself that my inner and outer life is based on the labor of others, and that I need to strive in order to give to the extent that I receive and am still receiving. A beautiful quotation because what it reminds us is that creativity, even the creativity of a brilliant man like Einstein, is never done alone. And this very famous painting by the French realist painter Gustave Courbet also reminds us that for every creative mind out there, there is a community of supporters, a community of peers, a community of enemies, a community of interlocutors, of critics, of people who challenge us to go to the next stage in our creative understandings and our creative beliefs. And I think what this idea of creativity does is it doesn't just allow us to understand creativity in a new way, it allows us to recognize that debt might not be what we imagine. Now, of course, you're all familiar with debt. You're all familiar with debt in one way or another. Usually, you're familiar with it in terms of economic coercion, a force that weighs down upon your life, whether it's student loans, mortgages, credit card debt. But what if we think about debt in a different way, in a more creative way? What if we think of debt as the depth of our social bonds? What if we think about debt as our creative debt to one another? How does that change how we imagine what debt is and whom we owe a debt to? So, of course, many of us who use Macintosh products, your iPhones and your iPads, which are all silenced in your pockets right now, thank you for doing that, will know that you have a debt in some ways to the creativity of someone like Steve Jobs. And in our society, where we're increasingly encouraged to think of ourselves each individually as competitive individuals, we glorify and fetishize the creativity of individuals like this, who by their own pioneering spirit and intelligence pioneer new ways of imagining, new ways of creating. But to whom does Steve Jobs and all of us owe a debt? Perhaps to these workers at the Foxconn plant in China, who get to express almost no creativity while they work 12 or more hours a day to solder together the pieces of the equipment that we use to be creative, to make music, to write essays, to make films, to do photography. Perhaps we owe a debt to these people, to this child in an e-waste dump in Ghana, where when our machines die, they're sent over there to be disassembled and taken apart so that the component parts can be sold back into the global economy with a massive cost on these people's lives and health, because the toxic residues of our equipment seep into the soil and seep into their bodies. What do we owe them? Let's not talk about how we can help people around the world. Let's ask instead how, after 500 years of European-led colonialism and imperialism, at the behest of a capitalist system, we owe something to the people around the world less privileged than us. What is our debt that we are incurring now, as we, largely those of us in North America and Europe, contribute to climate change to such an extent that millions will die? What is our debt? What is the creativity that we need to call upon ourselves in order to surmount these problems and reimagine our human relationship? And I bring this all up because I think that we live in a moment of profound contradiction. Another painting by Gustave Courbet, who we'll talk about a little more in a minute. A profound contradiction, which is that because of the new technologies that we enjoy, and because of the particular post-industrial economy we imagine we have, we've all been given tremendous opportunities to be more and more creative. And yet, we have no power of creativity, seemingly, over the very system that constrains us, that constrains those kids in Ghana and those teenagers working in the Foxconn plant. There's something profound that has happened, that we have more and more individual creativity and less collective or communal creativity. How do we solve that problem? How do we begin to reimagine creativity? Well, let's go back to history, to 1871, to Paris, where after a horrific siege, where most of the working class population of Paris had to go into tremendous debt, pawning their winter coats, pawning their children's toys in order to buy enough food to survive. In the wake of that, in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, executed for the vanity of Napoleon's nephew, the people of Paris declared a commune. They declared that they would creatively run their own democratic society. And for 72 days in the spring, they made decisions democratically. They decided their own fate. And one of the things they decided to do was in Place de Vendôme, which is a square in Paris, they decided they would tear down the hated sign of military imperialism. They would tear down the Vendôme column. This here on the left, surmounted by a statue of Napoleon. And Gustave Courbet, the great artist, was put in charge of this project. Well, he wasn't there at the actual taking down. When the commune fell, when 10,000 communards were executed in the streets in what was called the Bloody Week, when 10,000 more were imprisoned and sent into exile, because of Courbet's fame and notoriety around the world as a famous painter, he was spared. Spared, but they thought of a fate for him. He was forced to pay back the cost of re-erecting the Vendôme column. 33,000 francs. Sorry, no, 323,000 francs. 10,000 francs a year. He spent the rest of his life, short life, only 5 years longer, in Switzerland, drinking himself to death, burdened under this odious debt that he should never have incurred for simply following the wishes of his fellow citizens. This he painted a couple of years earlier, but it speaks to that condition of being hounded literally by your debtors. And don't we all feel a bit like this? Don't we all feel a bit like this in an age where the primary means that we have of dealing with one another on an economic realm is increasingly our debt? A moment when the first experience of adulthood we expect of the young people in this society is to take out a loan to get an education, which should be free. An odious and unreasonable debt that we expect should guide people's lives and their life chances. Of course, it's not surprising. Those of you who know the history of Halifax will know that, in fact, the first settlers brought over to this city, who built a lot of these roads and the stockades, were in fact indentured laborers who had to work off their debt after being conscripted from the streets of London in the 1750s. Here's a graph showing you the incidence of government student loan debt in Canada, and you can see how much faster it's gone up than inflation over the last few years. Is this a way that a creative society actually treats its young people? Is this acceptable? Where did the money go? The red is personal and small business surpluses from the 1960s to 2011. The blue is corporate surpluses. You can draw your own conclusions as to where the money has gone in an age of austerity, when increasingly corporate needs are put in front of democratic needs, and when increasingly every institution in society, from the university to the arts, is subjected to the measure of the market. So that now we all feel like we are, to a certain extent, in debtor's prison. That we feel that our own individual and collective creativity is fundamentally constrained by the needs to apply our imagination to ways of getting out of debt. So that when our youth graduate from university owing $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in debt, all they can do with that amazing creativity they've cultivated through their childhood, like we heard in the last video speaker, or through their university years, is applying it to somehow finding one of the few jobs that maybe exists out there, something that doesn't make use of their creativity, a job perhaps they hate, in order to try and get out of debt, or in order to be able to pay the rent while they do their other creative pursuits in their spare time. And the question is this the sort of society that we're willing to accept? Is this the sort of society that's worthy of the name creativity? Is this the sort of economy that we can truly call a creative economy? Are these the sort of cities we can honestly call a creative city? Because fundamentally, we are living in an age with a vastly unequal division of creative labor. One where certain people get to be extremely creative, but the vast majority never get a chance to express themselves creatively, where their creativity goes unremarked and unrewarded. Is this the best we can do? Is this in a world where we can now somehow communicate with people across the entire gulf of the planet, where we have so much creativity at our disposal? Is this the best that our society can actually accomplish? Is this the best that we can do for our young people? Here's an activist in the United States dramatizing his plight, owing $80,000 or more in student loans, dressing up as a superhero, the master of degrees, applying his creativity to highlighting this problem of debt that we are now all facing, that so fundamentally constrains and shapes our creativity in ways that aren't good for our fellow human being. In the United States right now and across Canada, there's movements growing to fight debt that are applying creativity, they're applying creative collective efforts to try and make us understand that debt is not an individual issue. It isn't something to be dealt with in that mortgaged insomnia where you stay up at nights worrying about how you're going to pay, if you're going to lose your home, if you're going to be able to get your kids into university. They say, and this is their slogan beautifully, "You are not alone." Alone. It isn't just a solitary effort. This is a collective problem, and it's going to take collective solutions. It's going to take new frameworks of democracy by which we can take control of an economy that is fundamentally right now out of control and that undermines all our creative efforts. There's a group in New York called Strike Debt who've been organizing something called the Rolling Jubilee, which is where they're using crowdsourcing and crowdfunding in order to get a pool of money to buy up subprime debt. Presently, people's medical debt in the United States, where, of course, you can go into tremendous debt for just having a necessary medical procedure. They're using that money to buy people out of debt, buying that debt for pennies on the dollar and forgiving it. Applying that creative activist spirit, which we need to cultivate, in order to get people out of this form of bondage, which is fundamentally constraining what we can imagine as collective, compassionate, creative human beings. You may agree with me or you may not that the solution to this debt problem requires the abolition of the capitalist system. I do believe that. You may believe that there are solutions within this system. But one thing is for certain, that unless we deal with this problem of debt, and unless we acknowledge that debt is a creative crisis that we need to solve as a society, not as individuals, then very little is going to get better. We know from the subprime mortgage crisis that happened several years ago that debt is a massive industry, not only in the United States, but also in Canada, where banks and other financial groups are extremely interested in making as much money as they can, not only from interest, but from turning around, flipping that debt and selling it on as an asset. We need to solve those problems immediately if we are going to benefit from the massive creativity we have as individuals in Canada, as individuals across an increasingly creative spectrum around the world, and as a human race fundamentally dealing with the problems of our lack of creativity and dealing with the problems that have been generated by years after decades and centuries of greed, of a society and an economy that has turned people's creativity against each other and that has turned it to the pursuits of making as much money as possible for individuals. I would end only by pointing out a debt crisis that's near and dear to my heart, because I teach at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, where again, a debt incurred by that school that they should have never incurred has forced them to cut programs and is threatening to merge the school with perhaps Dalhousie, perhaps another university. But the bigger problem beyond any of those technical details is this. Why, as a society, are we willing to sacrifice a place like the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design on the altar of economic necessity? Is that not a perverse and incredibly uncreative way of thinking about something like NASCAD? Something like NASCAD, which has enlivened and enriched the creative economy, the creative society of Nova Scotia, and the whole world for generation after generation. Can we not be a little more creative? And when I say creative here, I don't just simply mean individuals thinking up great ideas and sharing them, although forums like this are fundamentally important. I'm talking about rethinking our fundamental relationships. Can we not be a little more creative in the way that we imagine creativity itself? Can we not reimagine creativity not as the individualized, market-driven pursuit of brilliant individuals like Steve Jobs? Can we not think of it in the way that those communards of 1871 thought of it, as a way of recreating their world? I think that's the challenge that's in front of us as educators, as students, and as creative individuals as we move forward. Thank you very much.